Good evening, everybody. My name is Jenny Lang and I'm Vice President Advancement at the University, and it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you here tonight for this very exciting brain food lecture. We know that tonight is going to be a particularly special lecture for all of us, and we can't wait to get started. I'm also very pleased to acknowledge that we have with us Ms. Dimity Mitsis, who is the great-granddaughter of Sir Douglas Mawson, with us this evening. So welcome, Dimity. It's lovely to have you here. Would you please join with me in welcoming Professor Chris Turney.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to see such a fabulous turnout. I must confess there's more here than most of my lectures, so thank you very much. It's a real privilege to open the first Brain Food lecture tonight, and over the next 40 minutes, I thought I'd give a bit of an introduction into the great endeavours of Sir Douglas Mawson and how that's inspired a team of us to retrace just a small part of what was a magnificent piece of work. It really is associated with that. We'll be actually announcing a launch of a new expedition. And if you'd like to learn more, we've just uploaded the website, and it's called spiritofmawson.com. So if people are interested afterwards, please feel free to check this out. So why are we here? I guess the inspiration for me started just a few years ago. Normally as an academic, one finds you're firefighting most of the time. You're writing research up, you're writing research grants, you're doing the work, and then you move on to the next project. Having an opportunity to write a book is an incredibly selfish pursuit, but rather enjoyable, I have to confess. And one of the things is it does give you a chance to reflect. And I'd always been inspired by the heroic tales from Antarctica, Scott, Amundsen, Mawson, and I wanted to learn more. And I thought that actually what would be rather nice, though, is to tell it from the tale of why many of these teams were south, which is effectively to do science. This was like the Edwardian equivalent of space travel. They were off the map, and we'll show some evidence of that shortly. But in the process of writing this book and delving into a variety of archives and learning things which had never been published before, I discovered all sorts of ideas and thoughts which you don't really hear talked about much, in particular the way we communicate science and the way we try to excite the public. And this has sparked some of the ideas I'd like to talk about today. But I'd like to acknowledge particularly Dr. Chris Fogwell, who's in the front row as my co-leader on this expedition. And Chris and I have been working with Antarctica for the last few years together, a variety of locations, including the South Geographic Pole, with a company called Antarctic Logistics and Expeditions. And we've been going down there, we're a private company, to undertake research, but at the same time, feed those results straight back to the public. So we've been loading movie footage onto YouTube in the deep field, and we'll show you some of the things we've been doing with that as well. Let's cast our minds back, though, 100 years. Let's forget for a moment that we think Antarctica is significant climatically, environmentally, geologically, and let's just open an atlas from 110 years or so ago and see what's there. And you'd see something like this. This is from 1894, and we can hopefully recognize Australia and New Zealand, Southern America. And basically, the bottom third of the southern hemisphere was effectively blank. A lot of atlases of the time actually described it as an unexplored region. There's a few straddling bits of coastline, which hopefully you can see as bits of pink. But no one really knew what was down there. Was it one continent, two continents? Was it just a series of islands covered in ice? Was it a big dome of ice? Was it just sea ice, like the northern hemisphere? If you picked up a suitably appropriate national atlas, you'd probably see an image of a British Isle stamped over the South Geographic Pole, just to make doubly sure you know who it belongs to. So very nice one for posterity. But effectively, no one really knew what was down there. It was just a world of wild seas and ice. Just keep in mind here, we're going to be looking at this location, Commonwealth Bay. which is where Mawson's team went to, which is just on the edge of the known world. And many of those bits of coastline just down to the left of that, were actually, imagine, they weren't quite where they thought they were at the time. And crucially, a lot of the work that Chris and I have been doing has been in the Edgeworth Mountains in West Antarctica, which is approximately there. It's off the map, according to this. In fact, those mountains weren't really properly explored until the 1960s, so only just before Chris and I were born. So history of Antarctic discovery and exploration is really quite recent. But the great hero of it all, I mean, it depends where you go to in the history of Antarctic exploration, who you can choose. The history of working across the Southern Ocean, trying to find land. There are numerous explorers, but our tale really tonight starts with the great explorer and adventurer, Sir Ernest Shackleton, or at that point in the early 20th century was Ernest Shackleton. He hadn't yet been knighted. He'd been south once before with Robert Falcon Scott on a British expedition. And in 1907, he decides he's going to lead his own expedition south. He's an incredibly inspirational leader. He went on to do a huge amount of other amazing feats. But in 1907, he was a relative unknown. He'd been south 1 year and then been sent back on sick leave. But he recognized that science was important. And if he was going to raise the funds to get south, he was going to need scientists on board. He said, "I do not intend to sacrifice the scientific utility of the expedition on a mere record-breaking journey." He wanted to go south, not just to see what was there, but to claim the South Geographic Pole. And if he could do the South Magnetic Pole, the location where the Earth's magnetic field points directly down, vertical, completely vertical. But he didn't really have that level of expertise. But he knew how to raise funds. He estimated the expedition would cost somewhere in the order of £40,000, which, to give you an idea in today's money, is about $20 to $25 million. These guys were raising money within a year. And there were various ways you did this. One of which, though, was reaching out to the public and exciting them. There wasn't many government funds, at least not up front, to do these sort of things. So you had to get people interested, and you'd sell a tale depending on who your audience was. If it was businessmen, you'd go out there and promise them mineral wealth and maybe the odd mountain chain or a glacier. If it was scientists, you'd tell them there'd be some fantastic science outputs. If it was newspapers, guaranteed sales with some record-breaking feat. Anything to bring the money in. But he needed science. He needed that stamp of approval from institutions, learned institutions, to lead what we now know as a British Antarctic expedition. And crucially, he also made movies, photos, and audio. He made recordings of what he did as a way of raising revenue, and hopefully this will work. So we're going to see if this works. This will be a short recording, which you can find in the National Film and Sound Archive, of Shackleton speaking.
Throughout all this, I was helped by a party of men who were regardless of themselves and only thinking of the good of the expedition. I, Ernest Shackleton, have today, March the 30th, dictated this record.
It's hard to believe nowadays with an MP3 player or iPod, you can do hours and hours and hours. That recording was 2.5 minutes, and that was absolute max you could get. But he needed scientists, and one of the characters he managed to convince, against many people's surprise, was this individual, Edgeworth David. Many of you may have heard of him. He was a professor of geology here at Sydney. And Edgeworth David had caused probably one of the most controversial, given one of the most controversial, but least reported lectures in Australia. He was president of the Australasian Association for the Advancement of Science. And then Dunedin in 1904, he gave this fantastic lecture that basically said that Australians were too obsessed with sport. I don't know where he got that from. When the book came out last year at the Olympics, I was nervous, actually, even suggesting this. And he said, I think it should be one of the aims of this association to discover and destroy the microbe of sporting mania. Absolutely, he said, Australians worshipped the bat and leather of cricket far too much. And he said that geography was our charity, it should begin at home. Antarctica was all well and good, but we should concentrate on discovering what's the centre of our continent. Needless to say, the media just completely ignored the lecture. It's It was completely sank without trace. But somehow, Shackleton convinced him to come south. Edgeworth David turned around the idea that actually selling science with adventure exploration got people interested in science. At the time, it was very much seen as part of the empire building and going forward. And in agreement going south with Shackleton, one of his former students, Douglas Mawson, who was actually in the field, in the bush at the time, when the announcement was that Edgeworth David was heading south. And he wrote to Edgeworth David and he said, "I should have dearly loved to have gone myself, and in any case, be with you as far as my imagination can carry me." And that was a common situation. No one really knew what was south. People were fascinated. There was all sorts of geological questions, meteorological, vast amounts of oceanography, climate. No one knew what was there and how it influenced it. Mawson described it later on as being part of an enormous jigsaw puzzle for which we were missing a key part. Edgeworth David, though, convinced Shackleton that this man was actually worth bringing on board. Even though he was a geologist, he signed him on as a physicist. And Mawson was happy to go. And the team, in spite of all Shackleton's bullishness, was massively under budget, massively. And went south anyway. It was almost they had to succeed. And they went into what we know now as the Ross Sea. And after wintering over in the winter darkness for a couple of months, then pushed out and set off. Mawson and Edgeworth David went north to the South Magnetic Pole, if that's not confusing enough as it is. Edgeworth David is in the middle. He's 51 years old. There's a Scottish doctor there, Aston Mackay, and Douglas Mawson is there on the right. Compared to the equipment of today, it's not bad. The shoes and boots are reindeers, antlers with grass stuffed in them, and Burberry jackets and trousers, which only the best-dressed explorers had at the time to keep the wind off. It was the longest unsupported sledge journey until the 1980s, and they got to the vicinity, very, very close to the magnetic pole, but not quite there. They were exhausted. Edgeworth David started talking to himself. Aston Mackay was threatening to declare he was insane, and in the end kicked him up the backside almost all the way back to the coastline. And you can just see the cord there just going out of focus as he's pulling the photo of them all there. And basically with a thank God, they rushed back as quickly as they could. Shackleton himself pushed on towards the South Geographic Pole, climbed the Beardmore Glacier, one of the largest glaciers in the world, discovered an entirely new mountain chain that had never been viewed by people before, and got within 100 nautical miles of the South Geographic Pole. And realizing they were about to die, they also pushed back. And if you ever read any of Shackleton's writing, it's beautiful. He was a real poet, and he described that food lay ahead, death stalked us from behind. You can't write like that nowadays. It's gorgeous. They got back, and against all expectations survived, and there's Shackleton, second from the left, an old man, just 8 months after the previous photo was taken. And in spite of not quite achieving their aims, they became household names, particularly the Australians. And that set up a scene, because basically the South Magnetic Pole and the South Geographic Pole still hadn't been claimed. And in 1909, 1910, 5 different teams announced and succeeded in raising funds to go south. Captain Robert Falcon Scott in the blue, Roald Amundsen, who caught many people unawares he was going to go to the north and came south. Nobu Shirazi, who actually came through here in Sydney. If any of you have been in Parsley Bay, Sydney Harbour, they actually camped there for a whole winter. And Wilhelm Filchner, who came in for the Weddell Sea. There's lots of fantastic stories about these. The Japanese went around punching penguins in the face and filming it, so you can have a look at that if you're interested. And the Germans, some of them went mad, dueling, tried to kill each other, and it was mayhem, it was madness, but all good fun. That won't happen, hopefully, on our expeditions. But they all used different ways of raising funds, public and the like. The Germans, in fact, raised funds from a lottery. Mawson learnt a lot of tricks from Shackleton. And originally, it was going to be the British Antarctic Expedition 2, but in the end, Shackleton bowed out. And Mawson, who was only 28 at the time, decided he was going to go for it. He was only 28. I'm an old man now. The scope was ambitious. 3 to 4 bases across the Southern Ocean, Antarctica, linked up back to Australia, not going for the South Geographic Pole. He was the only one leading a team compared to the others who wasn't going to go for the pole, and they were going to go and make observations and measurements, just find out what was south of Australia. No one really knew. It was completely unknown, or virtually completely unknown. And it became the Australasian Antarctic Expedition of 1911, and tragically went on to 1914. Heading south in the Aurora in late December, they headed south from Macquarie Island. They got permits to set up on Macquarie Island 5 days before they were due to leave, so administration doesn't change, and pushed on further south. And in there, they reached the first bit of coastline they could. They struggled to find anywhere to land, and they found what seemed to be a rocky promontory ideal for setting up a base. Unfortunately, they landed at the windiest place in the world. They called it the home of the blizzard. It's labelled Adderley Land, and average wind speeds of 70 kilometres an hour. Average, not gusts, went up to 200 kilometres an hour. And this wonderful bit of footage was thanks to the fact that Mawson decided he was going to use the latest cinematography, photography, and he took an Australian national icon now, Frank Hurley, south of him. And this is some of Hurley's original footage. You can see it on National Film and Sound Archive. There's excerpts here. It's arguably the earliest documentary ever made. These are just short clips, just to give you an idea of the sort of conditions these guys faced. They used to race each other on boxes, apparently, as you'll see. There you go. Just fantastic. This disturbs me. There's a lot of pickaxes. Health and safety, eat your heart out. But this is fabulous. This was bringing Antarctica home to people. No one had seen this footage before. It was extraordinary. Hard to believe. If you tried to recount it, it wouldn't be the same as seeing it on film. Just beautiful. So you have a chance, have a look on the website. But the team pushed out. There was a variety. There was one set up on Macquarie Island, another at Adderley Land, where Mawson's main hut, and 2,500 kilometres further over, what we now know as the Shackleton Ice Shelf, another team. They made weather observations, continuous, to compare to one another. They took the first photographs of the Aurora Australis so people could actually see what it was like. And meanwhile, they had the ship, which was effectively like a fourth base, wandering across the Southern Ocean, making temperature measurements and salinity. The practical upshot of all those efforts was the fact that actually, after 3,500 kilometres of coastline by Mawson's team and others mapped, we started to have an outline of Antarctica we sort of recognise today. And there we are today. Just to give you an idea, so not bad. After the efforts of 1912, we had something we sort of recognise today. And the results started to actually put Australia in a context. Edgeworth David always argued very early on that Antarctica mattered. But what happened south, as we all know today, we experience here. You get a southerly blast coming through. And because of all these teams across Antarctica, and particularly the Australasian effort, these daily weather maps were produced. In fact, the weather forecasts, the weather observations from Antarctica were being wirelessly broadcast back to Australia daily in the latter parts of the expedition. And the result was that suddenly you could actually relate Antarctica to the rest of the world. And this was actually Friday, the 29th of March, 1912, which is the day that we think Scott and his men died because of these extreme winds circulating around Antarctica. But Mawson's team was stuck there a year longer than planned. As many of you know the story, they originally set out to effectively join up with the British base, join up a piece of coastline. And Mawson, with 2 men, Ninnis and Mertz, headed towards the British team. Now, the original intention was to strike out, map, collect samples, make weather observations as they went. About 500 kilometres out, after several weeks, They had a few weeks to go before they were due back at the base when the ship was coming to pick them up. The man who was leading, a man called Xavier Mertz, looked behind and couldn't see the one pulling up the rear, a British officer called Belgrave Ninnis. He shrugged his shoulders. And when Mawson looked back, he couldn't see Ninnis anymore, and he disappeared down a crevasse. With all the best dogs, most of the food, the tent, his main tent, and virtually all the supplies. They rushed back, but they couldn't see any trace at all of their friend. They heard a dog whining, and that was it. And they realized that with 1.5 weeks' worth of food, they had to push back. And they did so, but with a great fear that they would not only miss the boat, they would probably die en route. So they cut down their reserves of what they were eating, and they worked their way through the dogs. Problem is, this was before vitamins were discovered, and they suddenly realized that they didn't realize that they were eating toxic levels of vitamin A. They weakened, their hair started falling out. Mawson's soles of his feet would fall off, and he'd strap him on every morning with lanolin. Poor Mertz became mad and eventually bit his finger off and died. In spite of all this, Mawson continued to make weather observations, even on the days his friends died, and carried on. He cut down the sledge and he pushed back. 45 kilometers out, he found a cairn with food and supplies. The ship had got back in, saying, "Hope everyone's all right." But he couldn't see them. They'd been there that morning. He would fall down crevasses and somehow pull himself out. 5 kilometers out, he got to the top of a glacier that fed down to the base and went into an ice cavern called Aladdin's Cave. And there was some oranges and a pineapple. And he realized the ship was definitely in and it was all nearly over. And then an enormous blizzard picked up again. 5 days he was stuck in there. Just 5 kilometers away, he was home. Spent the time putting nails into the base of his shoes, and when the winds abated a little bit, he walked down to see the smoke on the horizon, and the ship had left that morning, and he was stuck. 1 whole year, with another 5 men who agreed to stay behind, and the 6 of them stayed for a full year, and hence why the expedition stayed a year longer. And that's important for us now scientifically, because the history of discovery and observation in Antarctica is so short. Here's an expedition that was down there for a far longer length of time than many others. And so you have baseline data you can actually make some meaningful comparisons to. And writing 1912 and going back and finding all these ripping yarns and the cover-ups and the conspiracies, we can actually find there's a wealth of scientific data, and some of it, amazingly, is still unpublished. And this is just one quirky little thing that Chris and I have been working on together with a team here at UNSW and overseas. And this is a map just published a few years ago. In orange is this vast swathe of ocean called the Antarctic circumpolar current, which goes in a clockwise manner. It's the largest ocean current in the world. And right alongside the coastline are 3 enormous gyres. There's one in the Ross Sea, one in the Weddell Sea, and both called Ross Gyre and the Weddell Gyre. And then a third one, just south of Australia, which rather inspiration has been called the Unnamed Gyre, which is rather fun. Going back through the archive material and find that actually, thanks to all the observational data they took, we actually now know that the Australians and New Zealanders during this expedition actually discovered this gyre, and they actually remarked upon it. And that's important because when we look at some of the climate models and trying to understand how the ice in Antarctica responds to warming in the Southern Ocean, those gyres look like they may play a key role in the stability of the ice sheet. We've got a paper that's currently in review at the moment, and we're now calling it the Mawson Gyre, in tribute to Mawson. So inspired by these efforts, we would like to reproduce just a small part of the Australasian Antarctic expedition. Taking the logo from the original expedition, we'd like to repeat some of the measurements taken along that route to discover just how much change has taken place in the South over the last century. And I'm going to show you how some of the ideas that we're going to do, it's very much inspired by Mawson. This is a work in progress, but it's inspired by his efforts, and not just Mawson, the whole team of what they did and many of the others involved. We've started getting a large scientific team together, covering a range of the natural and physical sciences, making observations as soon as we head south, from oceanography geology, ornithology, all the way through to climate modelling back here. Chris Fogel is co-leader, and many of you may know Greg Mortimer. He's a bit of an Australian legend. Greg is co-leader. He's unfortunately just coming back from Everest for the 60-year celebrations, but he'll be involved in the team and heading south with us as well. But there are ways that you may wish to take part, and you'd be most welcome. We've got a number of different ways that you can actually get involved. And if you're interested in learning more and some of the ideas I'm putting out, the website spiritofmawson.com. The whole experience, the learning experience alone, has been astounding. Actually, finding a ship has been an amazing experience. This is Shakalski. It's an ice-strengthened vessel, 72 meters long, and can take 46 women and men south with a crew on top. First thing, if you're at school today, Google announced the Doodle for Google competition. It'll be fantastic for anyone here to get involved. It's open to all schools in Australia and New Zealand, 10,000 or so, I believe. It's got to register by the 23rd of August this year. That's for registration. The idea is that you redraw the Google logo, inspired by "If I were an explorer, I would." That's the idea. And it's supported by Commonwealth Bank, which is fantastic. And amongst a variety of prizes, the teachers from a winning school in Australia and the teacher from a winning school in New Zealand will head south with us. So if school kids are out there, they want to lose a teacher for a few weeks, if not more, you'll be most welcome. So have a look, check it out. There's a wonderful range of resources out there. It was just launched today, and it's there up online. Another thing, the expedition is going to be going in 2 legs. The first leg is heading south to the sub-Antarctic islands. We're heading off on the 25th of November for a 2-week voyage. And we'll be returning into New Zealand, and we'll show you the route we'll be taking shortly. And there'll be a second leg going from New Zealand and making an attempt to get into Commonwealth Bay. And I'll explain just a little bit about what we're doing there. But there are berths for sale. So if people are interested and would like to come south with us, there's flyers outside. You'd be most welcome. Much like the likes of Mawson and Scott and Shackleton would take people south, we will be doing the same. This isn't really meant to be a cruise ship per se. It is a cruise ship. It's an ice-strengthened vessel. It'll be very comfortable. But it's an opportunity for people who want to get involved in a science program. Actually be involved. You'll be embedded within the team. You'll be doing the work with us the whole way. And for postgraduate students, anyone out there, we're offering up to 4 berths for postgraduate researchers, PhD students, to suspend their studies for a minimum of 3 weeks, to join us on one of the legs. And you will be essentially acting as middle people between the public who are going to come on board with a variety of different expertise and the project leaders as well. And you can find out more details on spiritofmawson.com. So a variety of ways you can get involved. But of course, it's not just about those who can go down there. We want to reach out to as many people as we can. And communicating what we find and see is really important. So we'll be using a range of different social media to get the results, show the landscape back. We'll be using Google+, Intrepid Science. If you're interested in that, you can follow us on Intrepid Science. Just subscribe, and you'll be able to follow what we're doing in the field. We'll have photos, movies, and Hangouts on Air. And for those of you not familiar with Hangouts on Air, they're effectively a way of actually communicating, not just with a group of people, 10 people, but broadcasting it live so everyone can watch. So you can just go on YouTube or the Google+, and you can watch us live, and we'll be having penguins in the background, seals. No doubt there'll be a blizzard somewhere, certainly a storm. You'll be able to watch us and ask questions. It'll be streamed live, and I'll show you some of the footage we can get on that. Much like Chris and I have been doing before as well, we'll also be loading up daily movie footage of what we're doing, reports on top of the streaming, and Twitter feeds that we can actually use on satellite phones. So whereas before Mawson was sending out wireless messages, very much one person at a time, the team will all be loading up Twitter feeds, and you can follow that as well. So just to give you an idea, this is a very short, well, the clip goes on for very long, but I'll just show you the first part. Chris and I thought we'd try this out. This is using something we call BGAN system, satellite technology. It's streamed live. It's expensive, not prohibitive. I didn't like the bill when I got it, but that's another issue. But what we can do, though, is you can answer questions live. So this is us in Antarctica. We're at 79 degrees south, and we're talking to Letitia here in Sydney, and I'm basically recounting the fact that I'm missing a flat white. But anyway, we will talk about science as well. So let's just see what the quality is like.
Oh dear. Well, how are you doing anyway, Letitia? You keeping well?
I'm well.
And is it gorgeously warm in Sydney?
It is. It's a beautiful 26-degree day. I've got the fan going.
Oh, I'm not interested. There's no wind blowing today, but it's a very balmy -5, so it feels quite warm to us as well. But I'm looking forward to getting home with a decent coffee. Anyway, I just thought I couldn't resist the opportunity to ring in real time and actually have a chat and show you a little bit of Antarctica and just show you what we might be able to do with Enderby Land.
We'll stop there. But that's the sort of quality of the film footage we can do, which I don't know about you, I was quite amazed at just how good the quality is. But there's going to be challenges. It's not just going to be a cruise. The image on the left is a satellite image taken a few months ago of Commonwealth Bay, and Mawson's hut there is shown in the middle red or right-hand red circle. And a couple of years ago, in 2010, a large iceberg grounded just off the hut. And it hasn't moved at all, or very much at all. And so as a result of the last few years, no one's been able to get in over the surface. For the centenary, you may have heard, for 2011-12, they helicoptered in, but that's prohibitively expensive for many of us. But one of the benefits of that has been that the ice, the fast ice outside, has actually built up, and it's quite thick now, we believe. So working with the Mawson's Huts Foundation, a wonderful group, restoring and preserving effectively the Mawson's hut at Commonwealth Bay, we're hoping to get in not only to undertake any emergency repairs that need to be done, but also do a range of science in the hut, including, as a result of this iceberg locking in Commonwealth Bay, drilling through the ice to see what the quality of life and the state of the ocean is below the sea ice. To do this, we're going to be using these all-terrain vehicles, Argos, which can carry up to 8 people. They're basically like boats with wheels on. They're fabulous. Even if they go in the water, you can put an outboard motor on them. With the tracks, they actually have a lower ground pressure than people's feet. So if you go through, you're very unlikely to go through the sea ice. But to raise the funds necessary to develop the full suite of research that we want to do, we're also trying crowdsourcing, which is a way of raising some funds. And if people are interested, there's a range of different unique gifts. If you'd like to support the expedition, we're using something called Indiegogo. There's the website. There's a link through Spirit of Mawson, all the way through from a warm feeling, iPod covers, all the way through to naming one of these majestic devices in your name, so you can be called, you can be preserved forever in a motorized vehicle. So there you go. And it's just this very short virtual tour will just show you the sort of route that we're going to be taking, covering a vast suite. So we're going to be starting off at Hobart, departing November the 25th in the Schakowsky, and then heading off for the subantarctic, hopefully. Here we go. This is sped up, you'll be glad to know. We're not doing it in real time. This is about 3 days or so. And we're going to be going to a variety of different subantarctic islands, working with the team there. Campbell Island, which is at 52 degrees south. The Australasian Antarctic expedition didn't actually get here, but this was too good an opportunity to miss. There is some early evidence of whaling stations down there, and we've had some preliminary results from there. But then push on to Auckland Island. There are trees growing on Auckland Island, going back several hundred years, we believe. And if you're familiar with the history of Polynesian settlement across the Pacific, they actually got as far as Auckland Islands, 50 degrees south. So when they settled in New Zealand, they pushed on down to Auckland. And Snares Island, which is a remarkable home for a variety of nesting birds, including mutton birds. And we're working with Department of Conservation guys, working through the permits and everything there with those guys. We've been incredibly supportive. And then we'll return to New Zealand at the end of the first leg and replace, get the sample sent off for analysis back on shore, turn over the scientific team, and then head back down to Antarctica. And this is going to take about 7 days, which gladly we're not going to take in real time on this trip. It's quite a long way, as you can see. There's a reason why it's called the Roaring 40s, the Furious 50s, and the Screaming 60s. So there's going to be a lot of toilet use, I suspect. And then we're going to get into Cape Denison, hopefully, using the ATVs, where we're going to undertake a range of scientific measurements to get into Mawson's hut and this immediate area. If you use Google Earth, you can go in, you can just make out Mawson's hut, which is just below the A in base. And after 9 days there, we'll return home, back to New Zealand. And rather wonderfully, if all goes to plan, we'll leave Commonwealth Bay 100 years to the day that Mawson and his team left. There'll be the old and the new, the Aurora, the Schakowsky. Mawson took a plane down south. You'll be glad you can see there the wings are actually missing. The pilot got drunk, allegedly, the night before and crashed it just before he was due to fly the Governor General. So they stripped the wings off it and used it, hopefully, as an air tractor. We're going to be using a drone to do mapping, not just mapping of the area, but also identifying bird populations, seal populations. And we did some practice runs just recently. And you'll be glad to know I wasn't drunk when I took that photo. But importantly, we want the legacy of our Australasian Antarctic expedition to continue, not just to be a short visit, producing all this wonderful science and hopefully inspiring people in science as well. In Home of the Blizzard, the team remarks upon the fact they spoke about features back home, including the Kerry Pine. And working with the Kerry Museum in Northland, we are planting up a grove of Kerry trees, a hectare or so, dedicated to the Australasian Antarctic expedition, which will have the added benefit as well that it will be fixing the carbon used to run the expedition over the next 50 years. It will all be fixed. Majestically, these trees live to 1,000 years. So this basically wraps it up. So I think I've probably gone over a wee bit of time. But for regular updates, you can check out Spirit of Mawson. The red route there shows you the first planned schedule. Measurements will start right from day one on the ship with oceanographic observations and hourly bird observations. The focus then on the islands, collecting samples, and then again repeating the oceanographic and bird observations where we will attempt to get into Commonwealth Bay and hopefully back home in time for tea, 4th of January 2014. Thank you very much.